People have a hard time saving and investing because you need to plan ahead, you need to budget, you need to say, okay, this is how much you can put aside. But what's pretty interesting with the roundup solution, the way it works is you link your bank account to our app, and then every time you spend, Bitstack will automatically round up your everyday purchases to the nearest euro and invest the spare change for you in Bitcoin.
Okay, hi Alexandre, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for joining the show. Can you please present yourself and your company quickly for our audience?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Alexandre Roubaud. I'm one of the two co-founders of Bitstack. We're both graduates from the University of McGill, Montreal. So I'm originally French. My co-founder is originally Indian, but we both met while we were studying in Montreal, Canada. So a few years back now. And I went to study in the business school of McGill. He went to study in the engineering school. And this was back in 2014. I then 2 years later, that's when I discovered Bitcoin. Spent a lot of time outside of school, just going to meetups where people were talking about technology, startups, and things like that. So that's the kind of environment I was participating in. And I think I don't remember exactly the first time I heard about Bitcoin, but I remember that I did end up in a meetup that was talking, only about Bitcoin. And so that's really the last time I remember really learning about Bitcoin. And in Montreal, for the fun fact, there was quite a growing community of Bitcoiners and people who were working on Bitcoin for already a few years. So what was really nice for me was that there was already a lot of resources and a lot of people that were kind of helping me understand Bitcoin. And so 2016 onwards, I kind of went down the rabbit hole, as people say, and started learning more and more about Bitcoin. In fact, to the extent that I started the first company around Bitcoin while I was a student at McGill. It was a research project that I started with two friends of mine. There were two other people from McGill, and we were building what was less known at the time, but very useful tools today. We were building what we call proof of reserve and proof of ownership, cryptographic proof of reserve and proof of ownership tools for institutions that were looking to own or audit Bitcoin. And this is what I always tell people is like people think that the big institutions are just looking at Bitcoin now, but already in 2016, and I know even prior to that, I can confirm a lot of institutions were already studying Bitcoin. And this goes from the big custodians, big funds or asset managers like Fidelity. Fidelity already had their, Fidelity digital assets company, their mining company, and all the big consulting firms, the big four accounting firms, big insurance groups who are also looking into Bitcoin. So we were building tools for these guys, and never became something I pursued post my studies. But because my now co-founder, Kabir, his name is Kabir, was also at McGill, and he was the first person to. So he's the founder of the students Bitcoin Blockchain Crypto Association, Student Association at McGill. He was organizing a lot of events on campus. And so that's how I met him. And fast forward a few years, we both graduated. Didn't know, as we both talk about now, we were going to work on Bitcoin full time. But it was still our nights and weekends. And I went to join a topic that was still close to me, which was just personal finance overall, like saving, investing, and just financial technology. So the next best thing for me was to join a company that was tackling those topics. And so I went to lead product for one of the fastest growing Canadian fintechs that was building a mobile app that was allowing Canadians to save and invest, but in traditional asset classes. So this was ETFs of stocks, bonds, and cash equivalents based on their risk profile, because Canadians do invest a lot to finance their future. I joined this company for about just slightly over 2 years, and then the company was acquired by a publicly listed Canadian neobank, and that's when I decided to leave that company and reconcile two topics that were close to me, which was on one end, how do we help people save and invest more, and then the second question is like, then what do you invest or save and invest in? And Bitcoin was kind of this new value proposition and this new asset class that I was super interested in. So that's what I did. That's how Bitstack was born, essentially. And this is like now 2020. 2020, 2021. And I decided to move back to France. So this one I pitched my now co-founder Kibir this idea. He was an engineer for Bombardier, so he was working on jets, on the engineering of jets, and so we decided to move back to France to start Bitstack with a very simple mission, which was to help people save and invest in Bitcoin, with this very deep conviction that people do need help to save and invest. So that's the first half of our mission. And the second half of the mission is like, what do they need to save and invest in to make sure they can, finance their future financial goals? Whether that's buying a house, that's saving for your children's future, saving for your retirement. And I'm sure we'll talk about it, but Bitcoin has a very strong value proposition on making sure you can store your money over time and making sure you don't you keep your purchasing power over time. So that's the second mission. The second part of the mission of Bitstack is to help people save in an asset class that helps hold your value over time. And so Bitcoin was the solution. So we started Bitstack that way in France. Maybe we'll talk about it, but maybe just high level. But because there was a new regulatory landscape in France that allowed us to come here, create a regulated entity to build essentially like a trusted brand for French people and then Europeans to save and invest in Bitcoin. And so in 2020, we came back here, started the company. We became one of the first French regulated, so what we call digital asset service providers companies. And then in 2022, we launched the mobile app officially on the app stores. And fast forward 2 years later, just slightly over 2 years later now, we've already helped over 100,000 people in France save and invest over 100 million euros in Bitcoin. And we're just getting started.
Oh, wow. That's a great achievement and a great story. And I like the fact that you went from personal finance and savings to the best saving asset class, which is Bitcoin. So you only offer Bitcoin on your app?
Exactly. There's two reasons we only offer Bitcoin. The first reason is purely a business decision because what we realized in France and the whole idea of Bitstack was also how do we bring Bitcoin and this new asset class to the mass market, to the masses. So how do we convince? There was this just personal goal of mine, which was like, and which I have been working on for several years already. Was how do I convince my friends, my family to buy Bitcoin? Right, like this. Every person who's bought Bitcoin and is convinced about Bitcoin's value proposition is trying to get their friends and family to buy Bitcoin. So very similarly to everyone else, that was also something I was trying to do. And when I started Bitstack, that was the idea. That was the idea that how do we allow, if Bitcoin's value proposition is really beneficial to society and people can save in this asset that will really hold their money over time, the goal is therefore to have everyone save in Bitcoin, just so they can have a better future essentially. So um, with Bitstack, we wanted to solve that problem. And what we realized was that most platforms or the big crypto exchanges we know were really tailoring their solution to what we call amateur traders or people who are much more enthusiasts about crypto and just cryptocurrencies overall and who want to speculate and make money by trading those assets since they're very, very volatile. But with Bitcoin, the idea was different. So the reason we chose only Bitcoin was to say if we want to target the masses, we want to have a very simple and clear value proposition so that it resonates with them. Because even if we were back in 2022 now, um, people have heard about Bitcoin. The observation was that most people had already heard about Bitcoin. 2017, we had seen like a lot of people when Bitcoin went from less than 10,000 euros to almost 20,000 euros or $20,000 a coin. People started hearing about Bitcoin, so people had read about it in the media. People had seen Bitcoin on TV, or people talk about Bitcoin, but people were still fearing to make that first step, or still scared to make the first step because either they didn't really know how Bitcoin worked, they didn't know how to get started, they didn't know which platform to use, they didn't know, they were scared about the risks, so they didn't want to take too much risks when investing in Bitcoin. And so with Bitstack, we wanted to address all these points. And so really the big focus of our app was simplicity first, lowering the barriers to entry. It's anecdotal, but it's things like making sure people can buy Bitcoin starting from €1, making sure people can buy Bitcoin use Bitcoin by like sending Bitcoin to other people or withdrawing it into their own custody if they wanted to. But it's also something the product we were known for was really the roundup solution. So this is how we really put Bitcoin into a lot of people's hands, is essentially by saying, what do people know? Like, what do people know to do is to spend. People have a hard time saving and investing because you need to plan ahead, you need to budget, you need to say, okay, this is how much I can put aside. But what's pretty interesting with the roundup solution, the way it works is you link your bank account to our app, and then every time you spend, Bitstack will automatically round up your everyday purchases to the nearest euro and invest the spare change for you in Bitcoin. So you buy your coffee €2.60, Bitstack rounds it up to €3, and the 40 cents difference or the spare change is invested in Bitcoin. And and it worked really well because people didn't have to change anything about their day to day.
Hold on. I'm not following. So basically, I connect the app to my bank account,
Yeah,
but when I'm spend, I'm using my credit card. So is it
correct.
like a Bitstamp credit card or is it my traditional bank credit card?
Yeah, there's no switching costs. So you use your traditional bank account and your bank card. So let's say you're banking at Societe Generale. You will link your Societe Generale account to Bitstack. You will use your Societe Generale debit card or credit card. And then every time you'll spend, since you've connected your account to Bitstack, we'll be notified that you've made a transaction with that card. We'll get the amount and then we'll round it up to the nearest euro or to the nearest, amount, and then we'll take the spare change. And at the end of the week, it's like you have to picture like a piggy bank. Every time you spend, we'll say plus 20 cents, plus 36 cents, plus 45 cents. You can see this accumulate in the app. And at the end of the week, we're going to debit your account for the total of the roundups of your spare change of that week. So it's about 10 to 15 euros to give an idea to people. But the big value proposition with that is that people don't have to do anything. Just like you said, you use your existing account, bank account, you use your existing card, and you just spend like you're used to do. And Bitstack takes care of the rest for you. So it's really a set it and forget it solution. And when you apply this to Bitcoin, this is how you put Bitcoin into people's hands, because now they get a way to invest into Bitcoin without having to do anything and without taking too much risks, because they're just contributing their spare change and acquiring, cents of Bitcoins or fractions of Bitcoin. But
Oh,
it does
wow,
accumulate. So that's how people get started.
yeah, that's really great technological prowess. Are you connected with all the French banks, or you like building up your connection base? How many banks you have today?
We support all European banks. So not
Oh,
only all French banks, or I would say we have over 90% coverage in Europe. In France, we have pretty much full coverage. The reason, the way it works is basically we have something called an open banking initiative in France and in Europe. So this is a regulated technology, basically that force banks to provide their APIs, so to open their systems so that applications like us can connect to those systems. So as a user, as a customer of any bank, you can request your bank to open their systems to a third party like Bitstack. So that's what you do when you connect your bank account to our app. You're basically saying, I'm requesting my bank to open their data or to provide my data to that third party so they can provide me with value. In Bitstack, it's the roundup solution, but it could be a budgeting app. It could be any other types of apps. So that's the way it works. So all banks are forced to do it. And you have now tech companies whose positioning is to build the connectors between the banks and the third parties. So we work with those providers. They're regulated entities. So they're the one handling the transmission of the data and securing the transmission of the data. And that's what they're regulated for. And that's how we get with one provider access to all the banks. So that's how we have full coverage.
okay, wow. So for the user experience, it's like effortless. It doesn't need you to proactively decide when to buy Bitcoin or
Exactly.
at the right moment, what amount, etc. So it takes out some of the resistance by saying, "Okay, I'm going to round it up,"
Yeah.
and that's about
So
it.
so that's that was the idea that's how all of our users get started. all of our users get started by doing the roundups. And as a result, and in retrospect with what I was saying earlier, it was a successful bet, because I think what differentiates us from most of the big platforms, the big cryptocurrency exchanges, is that not only do we have a very simple app, it's all on your phone, it's all on the mobile app, but we have over 50% of our users who are first time crypto buyers or Bitcoin buyers. So really, we're not targeting people who are already in the crypto world. We're really targeting the average person that saves money on their bank account, that has heard about Bitcoin somehow by friends or on TV or in the press, by reading the newspapers, and then they want to get started, but they don't know how. And with Bitstack, they have now, like you exactly said, and this is the word our users mention all the time, they now have an effortless way to just get started, and they don't need to know anything. They don't need to know when to buy, how to buy, or any of the technical parts of Bitcoin. So that's how people get started. Then obviously in the app, you can buy or sell Bitcoin, any amount, starting from €1. You can obviously receive Bitcoin, you can send Bitcoin, so you can use it almost like a wallet. Um, and so that's why, and then just to conclude with your question, that's why we decided to only offer Bitcoin, is because when we talked about crypto with that audience, when you keep that audience in mind, if you talk about crypto, they get scared, because now it's like, which crypto am I buying? Like, what is crypto? It becomes this very foreign and very scary thing, versus Bitcoin is what everyone has heard about. So from just a messaging standpoint, pitching people, hey, you can now with Bitstack, you can have a very effortless way to save and invest in Bitcoin. You're like, okay, I know what I'm getting myself into. If you say, hey, you now have an effortless way to save and invest in crypto, you don't recognize yourself in that audience, because you're not a crypto person. So that was the first reason we only decided to um, to offer Bitcoin only. The second reason is one that is more personal, is because when we talk about saving, and we kind of talked a little bit at the very beginning, you don't want to put your money into anything, right? Like, you have to think, I work hard for this money. I want to make sure I can store it in some sort of asset that will hold its value over time. And, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it afterwards, but people in France don't like save a lot, but they don't invest, right? So, and if they invest, we want to make sure they don't invest in some highly speculative assets that has a lot of risks. And cryptocurrency are part of the most volatile asset classes out there. And just personally, I don't have a huge conviction that they're all here to stay for the long term. I think if you're someone who likes to gamble, and you're someone who likes to take risks, and you want to trade, then maybe do it on cryptocurrencies. But if we're talking about the average person in France who has a savings account with their bank, and they're just, let's say, have a livret A, which is the most famous financial product in France, they're promised a 3% return, or depending on the interest rates they apply. You're not someone who takes a lot of risks, and you're not someone who trades. You're just saving and putting money aside, because you want that money to be available in the future, because you want to buy a house, like we said, because you want to give it to your children, or you just want to keep it for retirement. And Bitcoin is very different than the other cryptocurrencies in that regard, because Bitcoin is a savings asset class. It's a savings technology. It was designed to hold its value over time. And maybe we'll talk about it on why, but that's the design of Bitcoin, and that's the value proposition of Bitcoin, versus other cryptocurrencies where the number of coins can be arbitrarily decided by a handful of people, or the rules of the game, as I like to call it, can change at any time. So you're not really sure what you're getting yourself into, and that brings a lot of volatility on the price of the coin. And so that's why they're more closer to what I'd like to say gambling, versus Bitcoin, which is a fixed supply, 21 million Bitcoin ever, or slightly under for the ones that know the technicals of it, but basically 21 million Bitcoin, no more ever. And the rules of the game will never change. We know how it's issued. We know the issuance rates of the coins, starting from 0 up until 21 million Bitcoin. We know when there will be 21 million Bitcoin, at least at which cadence. And no one controls the system. It's an open system. It's no one controls it, or everyone controls it. Depends how you see it. But basically, the users of Bitcoin controls the system, and so and everyone plays by the same rules. It's a fair
Yeah.
game. Um,
So the value proposition of Bitcoin is quite unique in the whole cryptocurrency world, and it is one of the safest savings asset out there when compared to other cryptocurrencies. I want
yeah,
to understand a little bit about like the banking connection a little bit further because I
yeah,
find it quite mind blowing. I have seen in the past some roundups offers, but usually it's like for charities. So my
yeah.
question is like, who are you competing with when it comes to this technology of rounding up to send money somewhere?
Yeah, it's funny because I realized this when I came back to France, but in France specifically, people know the roundup specifically for charities. It's the roundup to give or roundup for charity, and people usually know it because when you go at at the supermarket or you go in stores, I usually on the payment terminal it'll say, "Do you want to round up for a charity?" This is funny because that's not how I learned about it when I was working in Canada. It's a very famous solution, but very much more selfish in a sense because people do it to invest because it's a very effortless way to invest and it works. Basically, there's a lot of people who have trouble putting money aside, and so Roundup is like the easiest way to get started because you're talking about your spare change. And in fact, people used to do it like I said before, just with the piggy bank, right? It's like a very old way. You spend, you get your spare change, you put it in a piggy bank, and then you break the piggy
Mhm.
bank and you have some money aside. So um, that's what we wanted to bring back in France. In France, people know it for charities. We don't compete for charities because with solutions that round up for charities because the value proposition or the promise that we make to the users is completely different. We're not telling you, hey, if you're someone who wants to give to charity, use Bitstack. Not at all, because that's not the promise. We're more competing with other traditional savings platforms on one end. On the other, we're competing with the big cryptocurrency exchanges, and we sit kind of at the between at the middle of the two.
Yeah,
On
what's
one end,
interesting about your positioning is that, like you said, like people are used in France to use these roundups for charity. So it's like money they are happy to give away. And so it's like much easier to acquire a customer by saying, okay, round up to save that
exactly.
that makes it like as effortless as possible for the consumer to onboard basically. And going to this argument, I wanted to know your perspective, like having lived in Canada and now in France. How do you see the French or the average French consumer slash saver slash investor? What are his particularities, and how do you see Bitcoin adoption and Bitcoin convincing, since that's what you're trying to do when it comes to the French audience?
Yeah,
What are the specificities?
yeah, it's very different from North America. We talked just a little bit about it off the record, but basically the differences, in my opinion, but I think it stems from that, is the fact that in North America, everyone is capitalizing for their retirement or for their future. Versus in France, and people maybe don't realize it because that's how engraved it is in France, but in France, your retirement is I don't know how you say in English, but it's basically we all contribute for the oldest generation retirement, and so the state kind of
So it's
guarantees your
paid by the
retirement.
government, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this what I call psychological bias where people take it for granted in France. That retirement is not something you think much about it. You think about it because you can't wait to be retired, but you don't think about the financial aspects of your retirement too much. Because if you're someone who's worked and contributed all your annuities, throughout your career, you're basically going with the assumption that your retirement is going to be guaranteed, and the state is going to give you back X% of whatever you contributed. And because of that stems different cultural a different vision on how to save and invest. So in North America, because they don't have this, people have to think about it from their youngest age on I have to put money aside, and not only I have to put money aside, but I have to invest wisely this money, because if I can grow this nest egg, this is what I'm going to get for my retirement. And actually, if I grow this nest egg very much, maybe I can even retire earlier. So that's what every American and every Canadian does. And that's as a result why they have, I think, more financial literacy in general than in France or in Europe, because they have to care about this topic. And what's funny is that because they do that, not only do they save and invest more, but because they invest more, they're way more exposed to financial markets, because every American and every Canadian therefore has some exposure to the S&P 500 or some exposure to stocks, basically to just some indexes that tracks financial markets. And as a result, study after study, we see that Americans have a much bigger growth in net worth from the moment they start till the end at retirement than French consumers. Because now, if we talk about French consumers, on the opposite, French consumers go with this idea that they don't really have to finance their financial goals, their future goals, like retirement being one of the biggest one, because the state will finance your retirement. And so in France, we save quite well, but we don't invest. And you can see this in all the studies once again, because in France, the biggest financial product, unlike North Americans that get exposed to financial markets, in France, the most famous financial product is what we call the livret A. So it's basically a bank savings account that yields more or less what the inflation rate is, or what people don't know, but it's pretty much the inflation rate. Um, and the issue with that is actually, even inflation rate aside, it yields historically has yielded between 2 and 4%. So even with 2 and 4%, yes, it compounds, but I'll let you do the math. It compounds way less than if you're exposed to financial markets that perform historically 8 to 10 to 12% year over year the past 25 years or 40 years. 2 to 3 4%. It does compound, but the result is, and this is the compounding power, the power of compounding. You don't get the same results. So people don't benefit from all the upside of the financial markets because they're just putting their money into interest-bearing savings accounts. And people don't invest. They invest either in real estate because they see it as a safe bet. So basically, the conclusion is like the risk aversion is very different between French people. We don't like to take risks in France. Basically, we're scared of taking risks financially. I'm talking, and so people don't invest much. They do save, and this is what we're trying to change, the behavior we're trying to change with Bitstack. And this is the behavior that I think is changing overall, because now we have two things happening. There's this two narratives. The first narrative is that for generations like myself, and probably future generations even more, your retirement will probably not be guaranteed. That's my expectation. I believe that we'll gradually transition from this system that we have today, where it's guaranteed by the state, to a system where at least we'll have to start capitalizing some portion of our retirement, because there's a deficit problem anyways, and the system is not working very well. So I expect this to happen. And anyways, also the second narrative is that people are realizing that they're missing a lot of upside by just having 2, 3, 4% interest. There is this concept that is called inflation, and inflation is catching up on the money you're earning. So even though you're earning 2, 3, 4% every year, because inflation is 2, 3, 4% and prices go up, your net purchasing power either remains the same at best or actually decreases. So you're worse off at the end of the day. And I think people are starting to understand that and are starting to realize, maybe I should invest my money, maybe I should, or save it differently. And so then people are presented with two options. Either is to do like the Americans and start being way more exposed to traditional financial markets, and to get all the upsides of financial markets. Or on the other hand, there's now this new value proposition, which is Bitcoin, that says, hey, you actually don't need to invest your money to really preserve your savings over time, but you can actually save in this thing called hard money, where your value doesn't erode over time. Because the reason people have to invest is because your purchasing power goes down over time. If I hold 100 euros or $100 of cash in the next 25 years, I will be able to buy less things with that money. So people have to invest to compensate that. But what is interesting with Bitcoin is that it's redefining what savings is, because you now have the option of not having to invest, because Bitcoin doesn't have this concept of inflation, or at least the same way what we call fiat currencies, like euros, yen, dollars, etc., have, where central banks print money and print more money, and so you have this monetary inflation where there's more money in circulation, and therefore your money is worth less because you hold a smaller portion of the total supply. With Bitcoin, the supply is fixed, so the monetary policy is fixed. There's no central bank. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. So if you hold one Bitcoin, your purchasing power of that Bitcoin is going to be the same today that it's going to be in the future.
Be the
Uh,
future. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And going back to the French specificities, then from an entrepreneur's perspective and from a regulatory perspective, how did you find France compared to? Why did you choose France? By the way, apart the fact that you're French,
yeah,
is there any stuff that attracted you? Because, like you said, from a market perspective, people are less prone to investments or to
yeah.
proactive investments. But why still you chose France, and how do you see it in the future evolving?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, if I thought only about that, I would probably have not chosen France. But um, I think there's a few reasons. The first one is, there is some part of it, and maybe I realize it more and more now. But there's some part of me that is, if I'm French, you want to build something that helps French people and helps contribute to the French economy. So there's some part of that. There's some part of just liking to take a challenge because it's both a negative but also a good opportunity. Is that in France, people there was way less people knew about Bitcoin and less people that were already buying Bitcoin or holding Bitcoin, and so there was this also challenge idea of, okay, let's actually be the person, or let's be one of the people that will move the needle and get as many French people to hold Bitcoin, because once again, the conviction being that it's gonna be beneficial to every person. If they start saving in Bitcoin, they'll be much better off in the future. So there was a bit of that as well, just the liking the challenge. And the third reason, probably the most business sense or business oriented reason, was that it was a much less, as a result, a much less competitive market, because French people were not really interested in Bitcoin as much, at least as in other countries. So there was less players, just a few historical players here in France. And the last reason is that France was um, taking the lead back when I left the company I was working for. So this was back in 2019, 2020, was taking the lead on regulation. Not a super interesting topic, but the only thing to remember about regulation is that before that time, this market was an unregulated market, at least for the companies operating it in it. So companies that allow you to buy and sell Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, companies that allow you to hold Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, were not regulated for that activity, for that business activity. Starting in 2019, 2020, France introduced for the first time a regulatory framework that said this is how a company that provides these services should operate. And in our um, in our thought process of, we want to build something to help as many French people and as many Europeans save and invest in Bitcoin. And if we want this to be mass market, we want to really have the average person in France, start saving and investing in Bitcoin. We have to go the route of regulation, because regulation also means more trust from the consumers and just a safer and more secure experience.
And I
So that's what we
suppose,
decided to do.
as an entrepreneur, also it gives you like clarity, because I always
It
wonder
gives you clarity.
when I
Yeah.
think about Coinbase and all the lawsuits they have and the issues that they have been dealing with because of the lack of regulatory clarity in the US.
Yeah.
I find it very hard for an entrepreneur to step into this field without knowing the regulatory
Mm,
background or without knowing where he's putting his feet in.
exactly. I mean, it's double-sided. It's on the entrepreneur side, it gives you a clear framework under which you can operate, so you know the rules of the game. Once again, just to simplify, that's how you can put it. And also, it gives you the interesting thing about highly regulated markets, just like financial products and services overall, like banks and now crypto players, is that if you tackle it well, it creates very high barrier to entry. into the markets. So it's both a challenge, but which you can turn into an opportunity. And this is what we're seeing now because the market is becoming very highly regulated now. It started lightly regulated, and now it's a very highly regulated market. And if you are able to be on the other side of the barrier, it's an opportunity as a business because for newcomers to come and become regulated, it's very challenging. It's very capital intensive. There's a lot of operational constraints, etc. So it is a business opportunity as well. And then the other side of the coin is that for consumers, and this is what I was also saying, it also gives them clarity because, and this is what happened in France after this regulation passed, is that they now had very clear guidelines from the regulators and from the press and from everyone on which companies you should use because they are regulated and they answer a certain level of requirements that are here to protect the consumer at the end of the day, to prevent money laundering, to prevent terrorism financing, to protect consumers. And so consumers adhere to that, and they now have whitelisted companies, so companies that the regulators are saying you can use them because they have the proper accreditation. And here are the companies that are not following the guidelines and who are blacklisted. So it's beneficial on both ends at the end of the day.
Okay, I think it's going to be very interesting following how the landscape will evolve. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. Thanks for joining the show. It was a very interesting discussion and also quite interesting business model you have there. Congratulations on finding this niche of onboarding customers effortlessly or semi-effortlessly, and good luck on growing to conquer the French and the European market, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks again for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Take care.